Thank you, Sandrine, for having us in this beautiful bookstore named after one of the most important and yet obscure characters in French literature, Albertine. Albertine was created by the French author Marcel Proust for his masterpiece, In Search of Lost Time. Proust may have had a very complicated relationship with his publishers, but I know this will never be the case for Antoine and myself. Mainly because we were friends first before becoming author and publisher. Nevertheless, working on a book is always a very intense moment where each one plays his role. And when it is all over, after all the storm that work on a book implies, there is this quiet moment that I like to take with our authors to discuss the book they wrote and just published. It is an intimate moment, and I never had a chance to do it in English, so let's do it now. While working on American Dreamer, I read over and over and over again your manuscript, and I have my own idea of what this book is about. But could you tell us the story of American Dreamer from your point of view?
Yes, well, hello everybody first, and thank you for being here, because it's great to see a lot of faces that are familiar and friendly. That's the tough part, to tell the story, that's the question that always everybody asks you, and especially when you live in this country, everybody tells you that you have to know how to say it in a few words. And the truth is, I never managed to do it. But simply, it's a story of one. It's a story of one character. Who is Mexican, undocumented. He's a dreamer, what you call a dreamer in this country. So he's been brought by his parents when he was a kid. He crossed the border, and he's lived in this country ever since. And he has dreams, a career. He's done everything right. He has followed this path, trying to create for himself a life and a story. And all of this gets shattered by the fact that, of course, he's undocumented. And at some point, as his ambition gets bigger and bigger, he realizes that he will never make it. He tries to get a fake social security number, he gets caught, and so the novel starts at this point where, he has to leave, he literally gets on the road to try to escape the police, and so, from there on, he's on the road in the southern United States. He goes from Arizona, goes from Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, California, and then all the way to Mexico. What really this is about is, and what I was interested in was the story of this character who lives in a world that's his world. He's never known any other world, and yet he has no rights to live in this country. And he tries to invent and create his own. He tries to create his own identity, and he's always, it always gets thrown into chaos because he never belongs. And so I was kind of, there is obviously a political element to it to write about these kind of topics nowadays, but it's not really what I was interested in. What I was really interested in was the psychological aspect of what is it to be, literally speaking, in a world that you don't belong to, and to have no world that you belong to, because if he goes back to Mexico, there is nothing there for him, or there is something there, but it's not the country that he's grown in, and so that was really kind of like the beginning. And but that's one aspect. And when you write, you aggregate all these other elements. There is obviously the United States. There is the land around, the land in which the whole novel takes place. There's this idea of Mexico. There's the fantasy that we all have of what we should be. So I don't know. That's how I would describe it.
Obviously, we chose an English title for the novel. For today, English titles are quite popular in France. How do you feel about it now?
Well, the funny thing is that it's true that when we worked on it, first I had another title, which Jean hated. So I had to work on that first. And titles are difficult to find. But, and then a friend of ours was like, oh, it should be something American Dreamer, we discussed this, and it did sound right, and I do like it. I just didn't realize that living here and having so many of my friends and family here what they would think when they would get the announcement is that they thought that it would be written in English. And so I had to explain, oh no, the title is in English, but it is written in French, and so it's, you know, but it's fine. It might have made some people buy it thinking that it was in English.
We've known each other for more than 20 years, and I've visited you and your husband several times in between. But I have never known you as an American. Let me explain. When I was living here in New York, I had a friend who was a student at the New York Film Academy. He was part German, part American. And he was doing a film about bilingual people living in the US. And in that movie there was the story of a German girl who was from Turkish parents. And she was living in the US. She was living in New York. And she was explaining that whenever she was going to get, let's say, butter at the grocery store in New York, she would think of the idea of the butter as Turkish butter. The word would come to her mind in German, and of course what she would get in the grocery store would be American butter. Now that you have been living in this country for 20 years and that you bear an American passport, what is it like to be French and American at the same time?
First, it's very new. The passport is very new. It took me a long time to get it. It's been 20 years, and I literally got it 2 weeks ago or 3 weeks ago now. As to the American and, you know, the Americanness, I don't know. I obviously, you know, I came here on an idea, on a desire, on a fantasy, like, you know, this idea of America that, like a lot of people, and like I think, like American people themselves, when they grow up, they have this idea of what America is, and it's carried by images, by, I think, a lot by the movies, by series, by, you know for us in France it was, and I mean, stupid people always laugh when I say that, but it was Dallas, and, you know, it's like the series. But it was also the idea of, you know, Tom Sawyer and the Great American West and all these landscapes. And so, to me, moving to the US was this initially, and it was New York. And as I discovered it at the time, it was also a world. It was also a gay world, a gay community. And there were lots of elements, lots of layers that were part of that idea of America. You know, and I spent all my adult life in this country now, so it's kind of indistinguishable. And I think that, you know, in my writing, I do kind of sometimes look for this also, this idea of a land that's yours without being yours, you know, that's not never completely yours, but at the same time that you live through a fantasy, through an image of what it should be. It's always kind of like mediated, and you're always kind of like looking for elements of that land, of that country, of what you like, and so yeah, it translates into the type of character that I write. They are always on the road. They are always, you know, again looking for something, looking for an idea of themselves through the country that they imagine, I think.
Hector Bianchotti, an Argentinian author who spent most of his life in France, once told me that at some point he felt he could no longer write in Spanish, and that he was forced to write in French. How is it to write in French while living most of the time in English?
Well, it's funny because it's also one of the questions that people ask me when they ask me what I do, and I say I write, and especially here they're like, even in France actually, people ask me that question too. They're like, do you write in English or in French? And to me it's such an obvious answer. You know, I do write in French because it is my language, because I don't think I'll get enough of one lifetime to explore what you can say in that language, and because there is such an intimate process to work, you know, to write and to work on the language and to try to express things. And as much as I love, obviously, my adopted language, I love English as well, and it's incredible what you can say in English and how malleable it is. French is much more complicated for those of you, you know, who have gone close to French. It's like you always have to find a way around things to express them, but yeah, I don't know. You know, it's for me the French language is the one that I read in, and living here, I don't think that it affects it really in any way.
Well, it seems to me that you read a lot of French books all although
I do. I
he tries
keep
to keep that way, you know.
No, well, it's really kind of the story of an in-between, you know. It's a story of like being here and belonging also to France, and actually your brain is always kind of like playing one against the other, which is kind of interesting, you know. When times are good here, you're good here. When the times are not good here, you think about the other country, and when you go back to your other country, you belong the other. You know, it's like this constant back and forth. I remember that. T. Lawrence always said that, you know, once you've known two countries intimately, you're never that far from equality in some ways. You know, it's like there is something in your brain that's never completely settled. It's true. But the funny thing is that that's more from an identity or a personal perspective. When it comes to the language, I have no doubt about the way I need to express things. I go to French
and English never.
No, I mean, I realize sometimes that I do express, and Jean corrects me, you correct me often because you're like, oh, this is an Anglicism, or, you know, there are things that I've forgotten a little bit, that they are not as French as they should be. But in general, no, my way of expressing myself is French. And it's true, I do read, most of the things that I read are French literature books. Again, it's really a question of almost time and of like, at some point, choices. You know, it's like you get into life and you realize that you don't have enough time for lots of people that, yeah, you could know, but you have your friends and you have the people that are important to you. And for me, what is important to me right now is my language.
As you say, the main character, Juan, is an undocumented Mexican in his late 20s, early 30s. He's also someone who expresses a great deal of doubt about his life, what career to pursue, which woman to love. And finally, he appears to be a man torn apart by the question of who he really is. Or of the above, what first drove you to conceive Juan as a character?
Well, I mean, like everything, you're right. I think it comes from encounters. You know, it's like you go through this life, you meet people, and there are things that talk to you. And I think it's always a story of desire. Writing is a story of desire. There are things that suddenly mean something to you and that you want to explore. And in this case, it was somebody in our family. Not directly. It was a little further. Like what was it? The brother-in-law, my sister-in-law. Yes. Who was in this case, who basically had grown in this country, in this country by his parents. And this was a long time ago. That was probably like close to 10 years ago. So it was before really. I mean, the Dream Act has been on the books for a long time, but it was not as a hot button as it is today. So I was really kind of like amazed at this idea of what happens to you when you've been brought into this country. You've your own story, but somebody decided for you. And this is a question that Juan comes back often to. He's like, somebody decided for me that I should be in this country. I didn't make that choice. And how do I reconcile the fact that my life is kind of like a mess because of that, and that I cannot get my identity and my rights in the same place. And so, that was just this close encounter. And then again, there is the main character, but then there is everything that happens. I mean, a novel is about one character that tries to go through a story, and along that story, there are other encounter. For me, the land is really important. The land and the context, the physical context of what happens to of where the story takes place is really essential, and it becomes almost a character in itself. So I built it like this, one element at a time. Again, the main character, the landscape. I wanted to talk about the desert. I wanted to talk about America as well. It's the second book that I read like this about a character that lives in this country and that doesn't belong here. And so there was this element of like, what is the story of America when you come to it from different perspective? Yes, there are these elements.
You've never been illegal in this country, nor Mexican. How do you feel legitimate in writing about this subject?
it's a question. So it's a question that we've talked about actually quite a few times, because especially now that we are looking even at trying to get the novel translated into another language, and especially to get it translated here so that people could read it here. And there is this question that comes back. It's less a question that people ask you in France, but here it's a question that people ask you, like, how do you write a story about, which is it becomes, at some point it becomes pretty intense. Like, the story of this character is Mexican, he's a dreamer, then he crosses back into Mexico at some point to go find his parents, and then he has to cross back into the US. So he does the whole process, crossing the border twice, going through the desert, and I describe things that are indeed things that haven't lived, and that are really, really harsh human situations. And there are some people who will tell you that you have no rights to write this. You have no rights. You haven't lived it. It's this whole question of appropriation, which I think is more, in my sense, it's more a political question than a literary question. It's like if we can only express things that we have lived, then there is so many things that we cannot understand. I mean, it's the same. When we read a book, we become the person that we are reading the story of. We basically really kind of identify with that person, and this is why we have emotion. That's why we share this emotion. That's why it creates something, and that's why literature is so important. So, if we cannot identify with someone as a reader, there's no reason we cannot identify with someone as a writer as well. It is the exact same process, and actually, I think it is essential that we are always able to try to understand what somebody else is going to go through, because that leads to this idea of there is a universal element to human nature. There are a certain number of things that we go through. There are, again, desires and fears and anguish, and all of these things are things that people have lived, have experienced in their lives. Throughout culture, throughout history, it's kind of fascinating when you read books. You go back in time, and people are expressing the same thing. That's why we still read the Princesse de Clèves. I mean, that's why we read books from, poets from the Roman times. Because they express things that are the same thing that what we are going through. And in that sense, I think that you can explore the story of a character like Juan, even from a perspective that's not yours. Now, I understand that for some people, that question about appropriation can be a problem, can be a political problem. But to me, the real question behind that is not can you read, can you write it? It's more about why aren't there more voices of other communities better represented in publishing? Because that's really what the question is in the beginning.
It's not a question of who writes, but it's a question of who is being published.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I really do think so.
Well, let's say that Flaubert should have been a woman to write Madame Bovary, or Annie Proulx be a gay cowboy to write Brokeback Mountain, or John Faso to be a worker or a farmer or a female dancer to be able to write USA.
Yeah, and it's not to say that the question of appropriation is not relevant at all. There is a place for it, and there is a place for it in this country, especially with the African American community, because it was, the story was always told from the white perspective, and there was an underrepresentation of people who were African American telling their own stories, or even Native American. So there is a real question of like how can we give more room to these voices? But I don't think that it should prevent us at the same time from writing stories for each other. I think it is important. And we'll see. I mean, at some point maybe we'll have questions from the audience, and maybe some people will have a different point of view. So.
Well, what's funny about that is that I believe that in France, different communities, non-white communities, let's say, would be upset if they would be supposed to only write about their own story, which is different from here. Most of the time, people show love to their homeland when they grow older, which is not your case. When you were in your 20s, which is just the day before yesterday, you were already very attached to France, especially the regions where your dad's and mom's families come from. In the US and in places you visited, it seems that you have a similar love for the land, which makes me think that you are passionate about the land itself more than about a place or a country. At some extent, the novel itself is a great road book, giving beautiful descriptions of landscapes. How would you characterize the relationship between your love for the land and the use you make of descriptions of landscapes in American Dreamer?
Well, first, I don't know if I've grown older that much, but I don't distinguish the land that I write about here from the one that I am in love still in my own country. I'm still very attached to my own country, to that region that Jean was talking about, which is by the Loire Valley, the region that's called the Beauce, and which is this flat land. And which actually...
And don't forget Marseille,
well, there is Marseille also, that's the other side of the family. But I do write mostly about my things that actually resemble my region in the Loire Valley, because it is this flat land. It is a land that a lot of people in France think very boring, because it's just like, it's like the Kansas of France. It's like endless plains and fields, but one thing that it gave me is a sense of infinity. It is something, to me, this idea that you can see so far, that you can always look one village and then the next and then the next, and there is nothing else, and then there is the sky. It's something that to me is really important. And when I write the first novel that I wrote, actually did take place in the Great Plain between Kansas and Nebraska. So there was that element, and I think that what I was attracted to there was the same process, the same land. It was a way of talking about my own land without it being my own land, And in this case, the desert is also one of these ways. I do love worlds that are far away, that are remote. We'll see. I'm not planning on stopping to write, so there will be stories. And I would be very curious to write something that takes place in a city, in a big city, or in New York, in a world that is even more mine, But for now, I've explored these places that are far away, that are quiet, that are deserted, that are abandoned, that are not the first world. Because I do think that in some ways the characters are freer also there to kind of explore what they are. I don't know.
But still, you don't explain what's the goal of this description of landscapes in American Dreamer. To me, they really have a very specific place in the novel.
So tell me.
Well, I believe that in some ways they reflect the spirit and the mind of the main character.
Yes, yeah. Again, in this idea that it is a land that lets you free to roam and free to try to invent yourself, maybe in a sense. It does reflect also, the land, because I do take the time to describe it, becomes, it's true, kind of like a psychological element of the whole thing. If it's the night, if it's the day, if it's a moment when there is a storm coming. There is a moment in the novel where one goes and he's in what's called the Saguaro Park, which is above Tucson, and he looks at the land and it's this big, vast, empty land that he basically thinks of as he basically thinks that it hasn't changed since the early days of the pioneers, and he looks at this eagle that just basically underneath him now, because he's at a higher point, and the eagle is kind of floating and looking, and the sky, the sun is setting. So all this element becomes a very meditative moment, I guess. At least that's how I wrote it, and it does reflect intimately what he's also going through. And it does repeat itself through, when he explores, then he crosses the border, goes into Mexico, discovers, again, a world that he has known when he was a very little kid, but that he hasn't seen since then, and that is a part of him. Yeah, all the elements go back to him trying to pull things into what is his life.
You are fascinated by space and stars and the universe, and you even published with us a book about that. Juan is a student in astronomy. What would you say this part of the novel? How did you use this astronomical topic in the novel.
Well, I mean, it kind of happened in some way because when I started working on American Dreamer, we were working on the book on stars, and I was again, I was trying to find out what the story of one was. It's true that I did want to integrate it. I decided to integrate it fairly early on. I think it was also for me a way to kind of explore the story of an immigrant or a migrant, or not a migrant, I guess an immigrant is more appropriate. An immigrant character that was not the one that is always depicted. Someone who is on the side of the road looking for a construction job, or who is uneducated. On the contrary, it was the story of somebody who is highly educated, who has basically, highly, as educated as he can be, and he's aiming really high in his career, and that's where he hits a wall, actually. But I thought it was interesting to kind of like take that, that point of view from someone who was trying to reach to the stars, to reach far beyond what he had been told he could do. And the stars, I guess, I don't know, it was very personal element for me as well.
There is a mystery in that novel. It's the hesitation that one has between two careers, either studying astronomy or being into the construction business. Could you tell us a bit about that? Because it's a man of hesitation that we said earlier, but really these are so apart.
Well, he doesn't have there is no hesitation. He's looking for a career in astronomy and in science, and construction is like a day job. But there are elements of it that he likes, which is the quietness that can come from it, the love of a certain job that's well done, the ability also to suddenly be in a simple world, because this world of higher education that he's been trying to get into, he always feels like an outcast in it. He always feels like he's one among people, who don't understand where he comes from. He feels like he has to hide the fact that he's undocumented. So there is a certain simplicity to the fact of being back in the world of construction when he has to, and when he suddenly decides to do it. But it's not really the job in itself that he's interested in. It's more the lifestyle. It's more the kind of people and the community that goes around it. But
it's a way to find his life at some point.
It does, yeah. But it's this constant balance between identity or unbalance, yeah. But I think that when you write a character, what is interesting in a person, just like a real person, is like all these different elements. We are not made of just one idea, one desire, one career path. We are made of all these different moments in our lives. We are made of all these different emotions that go, 1 minute in one way, the other in another direction, sometimes quite quickly. And so writing is kind of like about describing that as well, and trying to redeem this idea that no, we don't know where we are going. We try to invent paths, we try to invent careers, we try to invent an identity, and yet we have all these other things that we wanted to do, and we have all these things that we've desired or longed for, and they will never happen. At some point in our life, we start to think that it's too late. And all those things kind of cohabit in us, and they are what made us interesting. They are what make us human and fragile and worth writing about. And that's also what links us, I think, and that's where literature is interesting, to kind of like be able to understand why we all work exactly the same way, despite all the image that we try to project of strengths, or knowing where we're going, or we project all these things, and in fact inside it's completely different.
Once the book was published, I read again some parts of it, and something popped to my mind that I never realized before. Except for Juan and 3 other male characters, all the important characters of the novel are women, who bear very iconic qualities. One is an artist, two are mothers crossing the Americas to get to their children. Others, including Juan's sister, are entrepreneurs, and so on. What is that?
It's funny because Jean asked me the same question when we did a talk in France, and I know why you're asking it again, because the first time I didn't know how to answer it, because I never thought about it that way.
And also because it is so incredible that you read several times the manuscript. You worked on it several months in a row, and there are still stuff that you don't see in a book.
Oh yeah. But it's interesting. So it's true. The main around Juan, all the main characters are female, and then there is the figure of his father, who is kind of like a fleeting figure that he ends up meeting at the end, but that he never really meet. I mean, he meets him physically, but it's something that doesn't really happen. There's a grandfather, but it's true. The main characters are all female. I don't really know why.
I still don't know how to answer.
I mean, there is something, I came up with something very intimate, and that I find is kind of like, maybe like bad psychology, but about the role of the father, that links obviously to my own story. I lost my father very young, and it was really interesting. I mean, you might find this completely stupid, but at some point, when he meets his father, he tells him, why did you leave us? And I wrote that, and then when I read it, I was like, oh my God, I'm writing. It's so obvious what I'm writing. I don't think that is the main element of the novel, but it is kind of interesting that it's true that when you look back at your story, you realize that there are things that you say without really knowing why they are important. That's true. Yeah.
Yes, but what is interesting in the novel is the fact that these female characters are real characters. They are not just qualities. In novels, there are characters, real characters, and also shadows bearing qualities, And in this case, all these women are real characters of the novel. But in the meantime, they have these main quality that represent them, and that's what is so amazing to me.
Okay. I don't really know what to say about this. Yeah, I mean, each character there is a main character, but each character is essential. I mean, I think that the novel does need, if you want it to have depth, every character has to be thought of, and you do take time to build them, because you realize that, as you write, you realize that, the relationship become deeper between the main character and the side characters, and so they have stories that you have to dig into and write for yourself and imagine, and as you get into this, they become more, multiform. I mean, they're more color, they're more identities and desires. Again, I mean, the same process happens, and they are essential. It's essential that they have all these elements in order to be able to be part of the story of your main character. That's all kind of like almost a technical aspect to write.
It's interesting.
No, it is. I mean, for me, the funny thing is, every time I've written, the same process happens, is that I start with an idea, and in this case, the story, one of the main elements was the story between the brother and the sister, between Juan and his sister Isabella. And as I went deeper into the novel, I realized that it became a less essential element of what I was writing. And so, and it was the same thing with Le Vent des Plaines before. It's like, it's only as you write, and really when you're finished with the novel, that you know what is essential. And so there is this whole process, you've written this whole thing. It takes time, and you've already kind of like written and rewritten and changed the story, and at some point you're at the end, and there are entire chapters of the book that you just like slash, because you're like, this is not what is essential in the book. This is not what is essential to the character. But that you only know later. And it is true of some of the side characters. It is true of all the elements of the novel.
I would like to conclude with talking about a beautiful scene, which is a conversation between Juan and his grandfather, whom he hadn't seen for 20 years. Working on your manuscript, each time I read these lines, I almost cried. I also must say that prior to this book, I never thought that dialogues were your strong suit. This one I will read and read again, for it is so beautiful. How did you nurture this talent for writing dialogues?
Well, dialogues are tough because they are, you can express so much in so few words. But at the same time, in order to make them real, you almost have to speak them. And what's always dangerous is that if you write them too much, then it completely loses its own, it loses its spontaneity. So it's true, I've had a very hard time on the couple of texts that we worked on together. You always mentioned it. I'm also a big fan of Duras, who, a lot of it is dialogue. It's like these very simple dialogue, simple, almost like, it's just like 2 words, 3 words, 2 words, 3 words, dialogues that are very real and very simple, and they become incredibly poetic, incredibly strong in this economy of word. And so I kind of wanted to explore more of that. I would actually love to go further and probably work on theater a little bit at some point. But no, it's really rewarding to write dialogue, also because it's something that usually once it's done, again, you don't go back to it too much. It's really something that you can write in a day. You can write like a whole scene.
Yes, but now there are many dialects, and they are all fine. But this one is they are very precise and very just. But this one is very, emotional.
Right. Great.
As Antoine said before, we're trying now to sell the rights to foreign publishers. So in order to do so, we had a chapter translated in English to show it to other people in the world. And the chapter that was translated is part of this conversation. And I asked Antoine to read the
Okay. So now that you've sold it as being so beautiful, that's great.
And the translation is very good too.
So it's a draft translation, and it's only one moment in the dialogue. So if you don't cry at the end, it's not a problem. Because it's actually, and it's tough to read in English actually. When you're not used to it. Anyhow, glasses. Juan looked around. He noticed for the first time that the room had changed. The table where he recalled watching his grandfather's clean stones collected nearby had been replaced with a side table piled high with old boxes of medication, and there was a stack of magazines next to the couch in front of the TV. The view hasn't changed. Juan turned to look at his grandfather. It's not as neat as when your grandmother was alive, but I still enjoy the view. He gestured at the mountains in the distance. When it's windy out, I like to watch the vultures gliding on the air currents. They let themselves be carried all the way up to the top of the mountains. Juan remembered the story his grandfather had told him, that men and gods had once used vultures as messengers to communicate with one another. It was the kind of story that still spoke to him, that still moved him, despite his penchant for scientific reasoning, and despite the pride he had felt at his ability to distance himself from relics of such irrational beliefs. They were part of him, like the first lines sketched on a canvas. Keep going, tell me what you've learned. Juan assented, rocking his head back and forth. He spoke of how Elizabeth Samara had become part of his life, of the years when she was his junior high school teacher, of the hours he had spent studying at her home, of how she had encouraged him not to be afraid and to continue to pursue his education. He spoke of the teachers he had met in the years that had followed, the subjects he had studied in college and the construction, and other part-time jobs he had taken on to pay for school. I felt like I was taking off. Everything seemed possible back then. He also spoke of all the hours he had spent at the different observatories for amateur astronomers, of the people he had met, of what he had seen in the telescopes, of the Hercules cluster, always his favorite, of the hundreds of magazines and other works he had read, and of his wanting to select a specific field of research among groups that would be accessible to him, considering his educational background and administrative status. Becoming an astronomer isn't easy when you're undocumented, you know? I can imagine. But the idea that I could overcome it all was electrifying. That you could overcome the obstacles? Yes, that. And the state of things in general. Looking at the stars made me feel like there was a way. You were right to feel that way. Maybe it blinded me though. We're all blind to something, Juan. His grandfather was silent for a moment. And that's one of the beauties of life. His voice faltered, and Juan felt the old man's hand close over his own. Just being there, talking to his grandfather and confiding in him, without feeling like he had to hide anything, felt good.
Thank you. Now, if you have questions, I'm sorry.
Nobody's crying.
It's really poor reader.
It's tough to read a text that you've written in another language.
Arthur, you said that the title changed. What's the other biggest change between the manuscript you started with and the book you ended up with? And why did you go there?
I mean, there were no major changes once there were major changes from the book. I feel like I wrote 3 or 4 different books with different endings, and there are elements that I've taken out and then put back. So that's one story. But once we worked on it, it was mostly the form, it was mostly the language, it was mostly, there were, things that Jean encouraged me to do, to simplify, to get rid of things, to really work on the text itself. But I don't think that we really changed anything in terms of the story itself, No.
We just tried to strengthen it, but that's it.
But John is a very good editor, actually. So it's rare, talking to a lot of writers who have sometimes difficult relationship with their editors, and yes, and it's not always a very intimate moment. Whereas for us, it is. I mean, we both have, we had long and intense conversation about literature and things that we like and dislike and disagree on, and so it is conveyed in these sessions when suddenly we look at my writing, and I know what he means when he says like, this is wrong, this has to be shortened, this is not what you want to express, and so I think that this element of intimacy of confidence that we have between each other really helps to work on the text. So.
Living in the U.S. and spending your days in English, has that changed your relationship with the French language? Has it made you a better writer in French, or a different writer than you would have been if you lived in Paris?
I don't think it did in terms of the way to write or like the language itself. But I do think that what it does make you is, living in another country or being part of another culture is a privilege. It really is. You discover the world, you discover the world through a different set of eyes. You also have a certain freedom because you're outside of the world that you grew up in, so you have no boundaries when you arrive in that country. You have the freedom to meet friends that are new and that you haven't inherited from where you grew up and the school you went to and all of these things. And I think that all of that informs the way you look at the world and informs the way you understand people. And in that sense, I guess it does inform the way you write, possibly. But to me, that would be the main element. It really would be this idea of like, of encountering another culture that would make you a better writer, I would think. I don't know.
Where do you feel the most free? Where do you feel the most? And you have to pick one place. You can't stay.
Well, if it's one place, it's easy. It's a forest called Marchenoir. It's in my. Some people here will know what I'm talking about. But it's that region I come from, and it's true that it is my anchor, and it is, interestingly enough, what this character misses is this anchor, this place where he feels safe, this place where he feels he has, roots and an identity and a story, and so, kind of like in some ways it's like the opposite vision of what I'm lucky to have through this place in the Ravelin.
Did you always, have you come to find that as your home?
No, it's an old family, it's like my family comes from there. But not everybody in the family is not that attached to it, but it really, for me, it informs a lot of the things that I am, that I like, that, it's a place of retreat, it's a place of contemplation. There's this big wooden area where I've spent a lot of days and hours, and so, this idea of retreat from the world is to me very important.
But I'm saying when you came to New York, you had that anchor already. It was already something.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
Hi. Going back to the topic of appropriation, I wanted to ask about your process of writing the book, and did you have any process to really make the story more authentic and legitimate by speaking to people that have been in this situation? And one more question. You mentioned that literature isn't political, and I would highly disagree with that, especially coming from someone that wrote about a very political topic and worked with the embassy, if I understood your bio correctly. Do you do any work around around this topic here in the U.S. to help support these communities?
So, on the first question, yes, I did, because I did ask myself a lot. Although I do believe that you can write anything, I did think about it hard. And even while writing the book, I had my doubts. I came back to it, and the deeper I would go into research and hear these voices of people who, went through the border, crossed the border, got harassed, died, came to this country, suffered, it's like crossing the border is one thing, but even when you come here, when you have no rights, you're also constantly in danger. And it's true that I did ask myself a lot, like, do I have the right to write this? Am I the person who can write this? So I kept, I even had moments where I kind of like almost gave up on it, went back to it. But I did my research as much as I could. I met some people, several people that I met. It's not always easy to ask someone to tell you such an intimate story. I found that sometimes the stories that were the most intimate were people who had actually written about their stories rather than meeting them in person. But it was really an essential aspect to it. Now I didn't say that literature was not political, if that's what you said. What I said is that this book for me was not a political, it's not, my main inspiration was not to write a political story. I mean, I understand that there is a political context, and of course, this takes place today. It is about this world, it is about our struggles, it is about us as a people, it's about us as a nation, it is about, there are all these elements you cannot distinguish the story from and extract the story from all that. And in that sense, it does have a political element. But what drew me to the story was the psychological element and the psychological aspect of Juan's story. It was like, what happens to you indeed when the world wants to see you only as an immigrant, as someone who has crossed the border, as someone who has no rights, and what you want to be is just carry on with your life, and be out of this political process. Because of course he minds, and of course he has moments. I mean, it describes because it doesn't. The book doesn't take place today. It takes place in 2012, really. So when Obama gets elected the second time, and they were, I don't know if you remember, but there were already people who were upset with Obama for not doing earlier anything about the Dreamers, and and possibly not doing more, and so there are moments when Juan, looking at all that, gets really frustrated. And frustrated at the fact, and actually he's upset even at the president, Obama himself, and it's kind of funny looking at it now because you're like, this is so tame to anything that's happened after. But it is true as well, when you go back in time, and because I was writing that closer to that time, when I wrote some of these chapters, there was already a sense of frustration, and it's a very intimate thing when you live this through, when you go through your own story and what the world constantly tells you when you want to, you want to study, you want to meet people, and the world constantly tells you you can't do this, you can't do this, and even taking your car puts you in danger because if you have a flat tire, the police is going to come. I mean, it's like, how do you escape this? So again, I understand the political, but to me it was really almost like this, the feeling of frustration as part of this greater political world that we are all a part of, that I was interested in. I'm very interested in the whole political element and all. So I do follow this closely. My husband could tell me that he gets frustrated with me for talking about it a little too much. But again, to me it was going back to something that was more personal. So.
What was the original title?
Oh, it was bad.
I was hoping for it.
It was in French, so but it was called An Anchor for the Infinite. It was called
That's
that.
much better than what it was in French. I'm sorry,
But it was that way it was. In French, it was Non Page de l'Infini. Yes. Right. Hey, I will use it. Titles are tough.
It didn't make it for the subtitle either.
But some people are probably really good at it. But even when I wrote articles, or for me, it's always a challenge. It's like, except though for the novel that I read prior to this one, Le Vent des Plaines, I actually started with the title. It's like the title that really, and maybe Jean thinks that it's not a good title, but I did really love, Le Vent des Plaines is the story of this Icelandic woman that comes to the US to find her long-lost father, who was an American soldier in the 1960s. And so, but I started really with that title, Le Vent des Plaines, the wind in the plains, because there was a very poetic element to it for me, that kind of like, actually we were there together, where I was in Fire Island, and he came to me and I was like, I want to write a story around this title. So it does happen sometimes, but in this case it was not. I did struggle quite a lot. So.
What was your biggest struggle at the beginning? Was there any particular ones that you had to?
Through the writing process? Oh, it's a lot.
Was it the end, the beginning, the middle?
No, actually, no. The end, I actually knew. I knew right away. It's true for both novels. I knew when I had written the last sentence. I knew when it was done. The beginning, it's a constant struggle. It's like, there are good days, there are bad days, there are lots of days of doubts. But it's a good job. Alright.
Thank you, Antoine. Thank you, Jean.
Thank you, Sandrine. Thank you.